The state prosecutors called it a thrill kill.
A frenzied, out of control, violent attack.
She was a really lovely lady, a really loving family.
He genuinely thought he had done a good thing. Albany is a city in Western Australia. I suppose the most significant thing about Western Australia is the size of it. It's an enormous state. It takes up about a third of Australia. My name is Michelle Laurie and I host a podcast called Australian True Crime, and I also write books about true crime. Because my podcast is based on interviewing victims of crime, families of victims and investigators, and sometimes offenders, it's really rewarding to help people tell their stories.
Albany is a really small town. It's a nice little community with a lot of aged care residents and their families. I'm Rebecca Pepiat. I'm a courts and crime reporter with WA Today. I love it. It's really interesting. It's different every single day. I love sitting through court hearings and watching the legal process unfold. You get to really hear the details behind it, which I enjoy. Baptist Care was an aged care residency, but for, I think, people of varying needs.
They're environments that the staff try to keep them homey, they try to keep them peaceful. There's lots of visitors coming and going, there's lots of staff changeovers. You have domestic staff, people cooking, people cleaning, and nursing staff and administration staff.
Monica has been at this care home for about 5 years now. She had been diagnosed with
Dementia.
and more recently, she had broken her hip. I'm Dr. Joni Johnston, a clinical and forensic psychologist and private investigator. In spite of all these challenges that Monica had, her friends and family really described her as somebody who was a ray of sunshine. I mean, she just was sweet, she was easygoing. Monica's son said that when he took her out and they were walking down the street, in spite of her cognitive impairment, she would smile and she would wave and she would talk to everybody. She was just somebody who never complained, and you'd hate for anybody to have dementia in your family, but she just seemed to really never lose her sweet spirit.
She was very well liked. She had lots of friends, a really loving family. She had, lived a wonderful life herself, and I think contributed a lot to where she lived and grew up.
She was just a very well-loved member of the community. I know for myself, with my grandmother in a nursing home, there's a feeling of failure for some of us in the family that we can't care for her anymore.
I think most families really struggle with that. It's like they want to keep their loved person home. And yet at some point, for many families, as a relative gets older, they just need more help. They need 24-hour care, and nobody can really do that.
We have a lot of expectations about how well our elderly are cared for. Australian families routinely sell houses, sell their loved ones' own homes to be able to afford the best level of care as they age. Also, during the COVID epidemic, we lost a lot of residents of aged care facilities, and so now there's, I think, more of a sense of anxiety than ever before about placing a loved one in a facility and walking away.
Monica had had a fall a couple of weeks before her death, and she was recovering from that. She was therefore in quite a bit of pain at that time, and I think had obviously been treated by doctors and what have you. She was still going out with her friends that used to visit every fortnight, we were told, and take her out of the facility and take her out and about to spend time with them and get her out of the room, and also for her family who were there a lot and used to go and see her.
Monica's bell goes off and it's discovered that Monica has in fact passed away. I am Professor Donna Youngs. I am an investigative psychologist. It's recorded as Monica having passed away peacefully.
Jacob was assigned to be Monica's carer.
Part of his shift meant doing regular checkups on the patients and making sure that everyone was okay, and perhaps like administering medication and what have you, and just keeping an eye and kind of documenting any changes in their physical health so that someone else could step in if there was an issue. Jacob Hoysted called the duty manager about 11 at night and said, "There's no signs of life. Monica doesn't seem to be breathing. I've gone in to check on her. It looks like she's passed away peacefully in her sleep." The doctor was called to come in and obviously assess her. This was about, I think, 11:30 that night, and assess Monica, and he was the one that would have issued the death certificate to say life extinct, she had passed away.
Monica's family thought that she would experience a quiet, peaceful death. And so when it was initially reported that, everybody thought it was, that's kind of what happened.
The fact of the matter is that people in aged care facilities die frequently, and they die of natural causes. And so very often those deaths are not investigated any further.
Because Jacob was her primary carer, if he passed on the information to someone else to say she's passed away peacefully in her sleep, believing or thinking that anything else has happened would be the furthest thing from your mind. She was a 70-year-old woman with dementia. The doctor noticed that she had bruising on the side of her body. There was something about the way she looked to him. He decided, no, this matter needs to be investigated further.
The doctor wants the case referred to the coroner because it's unexplained. Monica was in relatively good health. Her hip was mending and the dementia was only early stage. She was only 70 years old.
The doctor decided to report the death of Monica Stockdale as suspicious, which brings with it a whole process, and frankly an expensive process. So it's not carried out lightly. It meant that her remains had to be taken to the mortuary and an autopsy performed. I'm really not sure what it was that piqued the doctor's concern, that made him decide that he wanted Monica's death investigated. Perhaps it was intuition.
When the autopsy came back, it was pretty astonishing. There were all kinds of bruises and evidence of strangling, and there was even broken ribs. And so this clearly did not look like a natural death.
The crime is an incredibly vicious and violent attack.
It was very clear to the forensic pathologist who worked on Monica that she had in fact been strangled. She had all the classic symptoms of strangulation, excluding external bruising. And that's something that a lot of people don't realise, is that strangulation doesn't always leave external marks. There are telltale signs internally, though. She had broken bones around her neck. The hyoid bone was broken and other bones in the neck were broken as well. She also had broken ribs, which suggested that someone had straddled her and fought with her, that she had fought hard for her life as she was strangled. She also had something called petechia, which is, again, a telltale sign of strangulation. It's not always there, and it doesn't always mean strangulation, but it's the presence of dots. It's essentially burst blood vessels in the eyes and in the eyelids, under the eyelids. Those were present at autopsy.
It's so difficult to make that decision as a family, to put somebody in a care facility. And then I think, here's this doctor who's now kind of reevaluating, what was initially thought. This peaceful event is no longer peaceful.
It's really, it's heartbreaking. There was only one staff member on the ward on the night that Monica died, Jacob Hoysted.
He was in charge of the floor where Monica was being cared for on his own on the night of her death. That was a regular thing where he would have been left in charge of looking after a number of patients overnight.
He was the only staff member on the ward at that stage with 14 patients. He was in charge of everybody's health and, in fact, everybody's lives. There's not a lot known about Jacob Hoysted for a number of reasons. Firstly, he was only 19 years old. And secondly, he was a pretty low-key young man.
He was raised by his mum on her own, and he had a sister. I think he had struggled through school and struggled with his behaviour.
Jacob Hoysted was diagnosed with ADHD and autism as a young child.
Now, this is a very difficult combination. Both of these diagnoses would have been very difficult. One, obviously, suggesting that he would have been a hyperactive, restless child, and the other suggesting that he would have been somebody who struggled to relate to others and struggled to understand others. If you put those two things together, I think you can see that we probably had a young Jacob who really struggled, who struggled to operate, particularly in relation to other people.
Impulsivity is a trait often associated with ADHD. If you are impulsive, then it makes sense that you are more likely to react to situations because you're not able to control those impulses. You can see this in children who, for example, they're playing with a kid and a kid takes a toy away and they impulsively hit because there is that impulsivity. Or they make a poor behavior choice at the spur of the moment. They might be very sorry immediately afterwards, but it's that inability to modulate their behavior that's the problem. It might be the fact this person is socially awkward and they get frustrated with trying to express their emotions.
He denied having anything to do with her death and said that she was a lovely person that he cared for.
When he's interrogated, he denies and denies and denies killing Monica.
ADHD and autism doesn't mean in and of itself that someone is sort of more inclined to grow up violent. They're not necessarily violent disorders.
I think it's always easy to look for some mental health information or some mental health explanation for criminal behavior. When it comes to autism, we look at autistic individuals or people who have been diagnosed with this, and it's very clear that individuals with autism are much more likely to be victims of violence. And I know that there have been several high-profile cases that have come out, and I know that the autism community has been very disturbed by this because there's been this kind of sense lately that people who are autistic are dangerous, and that's not, as a group, true. It's looking at those specific risk factors that's important.
Jacob, in his teenage years, was also diagnosed as having a cluster B personality disorder.
A lot of times there's a lot of myths around what is a personality disorder. For example, if somebody is a teenager, they get arrested for DUI, or they get arrested for shoplifting or for stealing, does that mean they have antisocial personality disorder? Not necessarily. If somebody is diagnosed with antisocial personality disorder, which is one of the cluster B personality traits, it requires a long-standing, over time in situations, somebody who's lying, who's deceitful to get what they want, who doesn't have empathy, they don't care, they chronically break the law. They're oftentimes experiencing regular consequences of what they do in terms of their either financial or interpersonal, educational. So it's almost like people get stuck in being a certain way. What the cluster B personality disorders have in common are unpredictable moods and mood swings, trouble controlling emotions, and unpredictable kinds of behaviors. There does seem to be a relationship between violence and some of the cluster B personality traits that individuals can have.
A cluster B personality disorder diagnosis essentially suggests to me an individual who has a predisposition to react, to have pronounced hostile reactions towards other people.
Jacob Hoysted had actually been institutionalised. He was sectioned under the Mental Health Act and spent, I think, about 9 months in a mental health facility, which wasn't that long before this offence took place. So he had spent time there and then was released.
After he was discharged, he kind of pulled it together to some extent. He worked in retail for a while, and then he decided to be a carer.
He would have been about 18 at that time.
There are plenty of people who have personality disorders, who have jobs, who are successful. To be diagnosed with a personality disorder, there's always some degree of what we call functional impairment, meaning it's disrupting your life in some way. But that doesn't mean that somebody can't have a job, and they can't have a job for a long period of time.
There was a history in Hoysted's childhood of violence against animals.
He actually created a school project when he was at school and wrote a story. It was a story that he wrote about strangling and killing a cat. It does show that he had a bit of a fixation on death as quite a young child.
If I'm looking at violence risk in somebody, what I am going to be concerned about is, does this person have a history of violence? Has this person made threats to other people? Has anybody ever put out a restraining order against this person?
His mother and his sister had both taken out apprehended violence orders. We call them AVOs in Australia, and they're the equivalent of the American restraining order. So an apprehended violence order is typically issued by the courts in Australia as a result of a police report. Generally, police will have been involved in some kind of incident in the family home or between family members for an apprehended violence order to be issued. . 'Cause 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 '
he confesses to killing her.
He then went on to give a full account of the attack. It's absolutely chilling.
It's a frenzied, out of control explosion of violence. We know he was quite new to the care home and was the only care worker on her floor.
After initially lying, he did confess to the police to killing Monica.
He said, I did it, I did it. There are some horrific components to the way he tells the story.
Hoysted entered Monica's room on the night of the 28th of November 2022. He observed that she was sleeping. He approached Monica first with a pillow and tried to suffocate her. And that didn't work. It was some kind of safety pillow, I guess, that they have in these facilities. It didn't work, but obviously it woke her up. He then went on to strangle Monica.
He specifically said it was taking far too long to kill her.
And in fact, we know anecdotally that people talk about how long it takes to strangle somebody. You know, in the movies, it's a pretty quick process, but by all accounts, in reality, it takes some minutes.
During the attack, there's a complete lack of awareness of the humanity of Monica.
He told the police that Monica kept pulling the bell cord next to her bed off and it was getting caught in her arm, and that he, at some point between that happening, had taken the bell cord off.
He takes the bell cord and winds it round her neck to strangle her.
The buzzer for attention sounds 10 times during the attack, and no other staff member came to see what was happening in her room.
He said after the next snap, I'm sure that she was gone. He said, I felt disgusted. I couldn't believe I'd done it. I was scared. I was wearing double gloves on both hands. I was thinking of marks and handprints. I thought, I've got to grab everything that I've used.
He did take some time to tidy up the crime scene, we know now. Hoysted threw away the gloves that he was wearing, for example. He tidied up the room. I can imagine it was in some disarray, given how hard Monica had fought for her life. He also washed her neck. I know there was no bruising to the neck, so I'm assuming he was thinking about DNA from his hands or something, even though he was wearing gloves.
For her to be the innocent victim of this kind of frenzied, violent murder, and for their family to find out the day before Christmas that this is what had happened to their mother, that they put in a place where they could trust that she would be cared for, must have been beyond painful.
Her family are very well known because they're good people. They're a beautiful family, and so it's been devastating.
It wasn't a typical story because most of the murders that I've covered over here have been domestic violence incidents or a murder that has happened that probably would end up being like a manslaughter charge where someone's died in an accident gone horribly wrong and someone's been charged over that.
In Australia, it's not up to the prosecution to prove motive in a homicide case. That's not part of the requirement of the court.
But I think ultimately it actually became an issue in the courts between the lawyers about Jacob's motivation, because it would have had a different outcome for him in his sentencing. It would have meant that there would have been some leniency there for him.
There was no question as to whether or not Hoysted had committed this crime. It was just about what they were going to do with him.
I don't think he ever raised suspicions with the staff. They did say ultimately that he was a very unemotional person and quite quiet. He definitely wasn't an exhibitionist and definitely wasn't walking around talking about ideas of killing people. And so of course when Monica's passed away, I don't think anyone thought anything other than she has passed away peacefully in her sleep. So that probably just goes back to how he had presented himself the whole time that he'd worked there, which I think had been about 12 months. He gained everyone's trust. No one had any reason to believe otherwise. Jacob Hoysted's defence team told the court that he liked her, he was friends with her, he did have good conversations with her, he cared for her really well. And they tried to argue that the reason he had killed Monica Stockdale was to put her out of her misery. Ultimately, he felt that Monica had deteriorated in health in previous weeks and that she was close to death.
He suggested that she was better off going through 5 minutes of pain than 3 to 6 months of further decline.
He said to Monica that we all love you dearly, the pain is too much to bear, it's time for you to go back to your mum and dad.
I think the defence was trying to really drive home the disorders that this young man had that created the impression in his mind that he was being helpful in what he did.
The thing is, nobody else is talking about the fact that Monica is in so much pain or that she's unhappy or anything like that. There's no reason to believe that that's true. It's hard to imagine he couldn't find some kind of medication or steal some kind of medication if he really believed that, you know, he needed to put this person asleep.
Monica wasn't sick. She had suffered that fall that she was recovering from. I think she was receiving pain medication for that. But other than that, she was in good health apart from her dementia. Was he just so psychologically not with it that he thought that he was doing the right thing? Maybe in his right mind he was trying to help her. Did he fully believe that? Jacob Hoysted's defence team tried to argue that he had done it to try and help her in that moment.
Hoysted's family and friends have reported that he did have what they call a fascination with death and the ways that serial killers went about their business, a certain admiration for serial killers.
There was a real interest in all things violent from Jacob.
His own lawyer said that he had a fixation on death.
When you have people who are talking about violence and preoccupation with violence and serial killer and those kinds of things, I mean, those are things to be concerned about, but they don't necessarily point to any certain diagnosis unless something along the lines of psychopathy.
Police were looking at Hoysted, and so they visited his residence. When they did, he invited them in, gave them permission to look around. He confessed fairly freely to police that once he realised that Monica's death was going to be looked at, he seriously considered breaking into the mortuary and, in his words, hacking her up to try and conceal the evidence. So obviously we're talking about a person who's not thinking clearly, strategically, if you will. I mean, that's a really bizarre plan.
He told the police, he admitted it afterwards, and although he had cleaned her up extensively, obviously she had these horrific injuries, but he'd worn the double gloves and he was trying to hide his evidence at the time.
These kinds of drastic measures are something that we often see with people who have lost total control. And then in the aftermath, they feel a sense of guilt, of panic, but they are aware that they have lost control and need to cover the evidence.
So police conducted a search of his phone and they found search history that showed that before Monica's death, he was making searches such as how to suffocate someone, how do you kill someone with a pillow, how do you strangle someone. After her death, he was then also searching up things like how to tell if someone is dead. Does someone's pupils dilate when they are dead? What do someone's eyes look like after they are dead?
We would think he would understand not to use his phone to search things like how to suffocate people, how to know when people are dead, how to hide suffocation. But all of those search results were found on his phone.
Just clear that he's searching for things that kind of suggest a premeditation, that he's really researching this and is kind of morbidly curious about some of the things, in addition to there being the question that she's perhaps looking for ways to kill her.
The state prosecutors sort of put to the court that Jacob Hoysted was someone who was a maniac, who wanted to experience killing someone, that he wanted to feel someone die under his hands. And they called it a thrill kill. Jacob actually said to the police, and they referenced it in court, that he said he had struggled with thoughts like that his whole life. So he had struggled with himself, thoughts of killing someone and seeing what it felt like to kill someone. And he was open and honest about that with the police. He wrote about killing and strangling a cat and then ultimately strangled this poor old lady. So there must have been something in him that was driving him towards acting out a fantasy.
These researches, these investigations about how to kill somebody, how to suffocate somebody, what I think they tell us is that for Jacob, this narrative was bubbling up to a dangerous point. The desire to carry out an offence like this was raging within him for months. And yes, I think it was reaching a point where he was starting to think about actually putting it into action. And then he's presented with an opportunity when he comes on shift and he's the only person and there's a vulnerable victim.
Never before or since yet have I sat through hearing that someone potentially just wanted to experience the feel of someone passing away under their hands.
What we often see with these kinds of cases is that the violent, frenzied attack is actually the final act in the melodrama of their lives, and that once it's done, they just give up, they just self-destruct. So I'm not surprised that Jacob pleads guilty. It's as if his whole life has been all about the sense of hostility, but now he's enacted it in this horrific crime. He's left empty and with nothing.
For a 20-year-old, then 19-year-old person, I mean, I had teenagers. I struggle to believe that anyone would want to experience that. And so the alternative theory being that he thought he was helping her die sat better with me. At the very least, I felt like that would be an easier theory, an easier motive to accept, and possibly potentially for her family as well, because thinking that he had done it for the thrill is just horrific and puts him in the category of being a psychopath. And that's a really scary thought, knowing that someone with that capability was working with such vulnerable people.
The brutal way that he murdered her, in and of itself, it contradicts his claim that he is somehow putting her out of her misery.
Make no mistakes, in the moment of this crime, the sole purpose was to inflict maximum suffering on the victim. So the idea that Jacob Hoysted committed this offence to put Monica out of her misery is nonsensical.
In the end, Hoysted was sentenced to life imprisonment. He was not sent to a psychiatric facility by the judge, and I think that was a reflection of the seriousness of the crime and also of the need to give some confidence back to the community that this can't happen, it shouldn't have happened, and we won't let it happen again.
It was made clear through the whole of the sentencing process, and it was obvious from where I was sitting, that Jacob Hoysted had no emotions. It was made clear that was part of the problem as to why he thought that it was a great idea to take someone else's life. He had no emotional connection with that, despite claiming that he cared for and loved Monica Stockdale. Those police interviews were played in the court and showed him quite calmly telling the officers in detail what he'd done to her, the extent to which he inflicted violence on her to end her life. He was not crying, he was not disturbed at all. And when he sat in the dock in front of us and was sentenced to life in prison for what he'd done, he didn't register any reaction whatsoever.
I assume that he would be on a lot of medication. I suggest he was probably fairly heavily sedated.
He sat there calmly the way he had through the entire sentencing, listened to what was said to him and the directions that the judge gave him, and then when he was told to stand up and leave, he did, and he was taken downstairs. Made no noise or facial expressions whatsoever.
It's been devastating to think that this could happen to someone you know, someone you respect, a much loved mother and grandmother. Jacob Hoysted's family has to live through that. They tried to gain access to help for him. They tried the legal route with the apprehended violence order. They had him hospitalised, and they're living their lives in this tiny community where something terrible happened to all of them, really. I mean, disappointing doesn't cover it. It's really upsetting that he was sent back out into the world, obviously without the tools that he needed to survive and to be a functioning member of society, let alone that he was able to gain employment with vulnerable people. We've had a number of systems fail in this situation.
His own barrister said to the court, I can't believe that someone with his history was allowed to work with such vulnerable people, because he should never have been. The hallmarks were there, even if he never would have got the opportunity, but he should never have been put in a position where he had the opportunity to act out that fantasy. But with a decent amount of checking through his health records, there would have been some signs along the way that could have at least prevented him from being given the opportunity to work with people who are so vulnerable. But it wasn't done.
I always think about situations like this, it's like Swiss cheese. You know, enough slices of Swiss cheese, if the holes line up, really bad things happen. And this is one of those, you know, the gaps in our social services, in our mental health system and in our aged care system all lined up and led to a violent, horrific death for a beautiful lady.
I think while there could have been better screening, I also think it doesn't mitigate Jacob's personal responsibility for the actions he took while he was there.
Aged care is a very big issue in Australia. We have an ageing population, and so many of us have family in aged care. In 2018, there was a Royal Commission into our aged care industry, and that means that the federal government called for an investigation into how successful or unsuccessful the sector was and what could be improved. It seems like an absolute no-brainer, but through this tragedy, we discovered that there simply weren't enough.
There are a whole raft of people that should have looked a lot closer at this situation, and I just hope that after this case there have been more checks and balances put in place.
I mean, I think the other thing is that when somebody has an unexpected death, it always needs to be investigated as a homicide first. I do believe that if he had not been caught, that it would have happened again.